Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or even good night. Some of our speakers are tuning in during the night for this event. Wherever you are in the world, welcome to this 7th OECD Forum on Green Finance and Investment. My name is Hugh Whelan, co-founder and joint managing director of Responsible Investor, the leading online journalism and events platform for ESG and sustainable finance for the global institutional investment market, investors, corporates, banks and insurers. And I'm going to be chairing this forum, looking forward to several days of great discussion and debate. Do take a look in the sponsors section of the website for a link to our work and to a free no strings trial to our journalism, which we've been producing for 13 years now, covering the vital sustainable investment subjects that we will be debating at this forum, which of course is the flagship annual global event of the OECD Centre on Green Finance and Investment, established back in October 2016. And this year, the forum, of course, is being convened entirely online over the course of 4 half days from today, 6th of October through to the 9th. And incredibly, we've got over 3,000 participants registered for this event. Great to have you all here. I'm really looking forward to your input into the event. Now, I know it's nice, of course, to convene in person at the OECD for this event, but it's obviously going to be something that's happening much less often. And it's worth noting that in the context of this event alone, 1,000 tons of CO2 have been avoided by not traveling to the conference. And this is a clear version of the future that we're seeing until we can clean up transportation and make it fully sustainable. So thanks to you all for being here digitally. We hope to make this event as interactive and exciting as possible. Our thanks also to the government of Japan for their generous support of the event as main headline sponsor and for their sponsorship of broader activities of the OECD Environment Directorate on Green Finance and Investment. And also back in the sponsors section that I mentioned earlier, check out the profiles of the sponsors of this event. And on behalf of the OECD, thanks to Iberdrola and the other sponsors for their support for this year's forum. Really appreciated support on their behalf. This year, the forum's theme is financing a green recovery and maintaining momentum for green finance and investment. So over the course of the next 4 days, we're going to be featuring a series of virtual panels and keynote addresses on a range of topics, all the way from financing sustainable oceans through to biodiversity finance, ESG investing, blockchain and taxonomies, right through to infrastructure investing, clean energy and green recovery, both in emerging and developing economies. And you will probably know that all the sessions will be broadcast live here on the dedicated forum platform, but the recordings will also be available on demand on the website of the OECD Centre for Green Finance and Investment after the forum. So you can watch again or pass on the links to peers and colleagues for them to tune in to the forum sessions. It's also useful for you to keep track of the program by adding sessions to your diary agendas through the forum platform. Always a really useful way of knowing which sessions you're going to be tuning into. Please also use the platform to message and network with fellow attendees. Great way of seeing who else is here tuned into this event and contacting them as the event progresses. As with most things these days, the forum, of course, is covered on Twitter. The hashtag to tweet on the event is hashtag OECDGFI. And that's going to be shown on the screen throughout the event. And we'd encourage you to tweet your views and responses during the forum. A quick reminder that at the end of today, there'll also be a special session moderated by the OECD Secretariat to facilitate interactive and open discussions amongst all participants. And that's a session where you can get very much involved in actually putting your perspective across to the OECD and joining in the discussion. During the event, of course, you can respond to live polls, ask questions and post comments in the usual way via the chat space in the platform, and all questions and comments are moderated and passed through to me as the chair and to the other moderators of the panel. And our job, of course, is to try and answer as many of those questions as we can and make your involvement in this event as fruitful as possible. Just to reiterate and to solidify that, I'm now going to hand over to Robert Youngman, Team Leader, Green Finance and Investment at the Environment Directorate of the OECD, who's going to give some housekeeping notes to make your involvement in this event as enjoyable and useful as possible. Rob, over to you.
Thanks very much, Hugh. And I'd just like to say on behalf of the Forum team, Geraldine, Elodie, Ayush, Dirk, Mireille, Zuzuri, Nasera, Beth, and Sama, all of whom have been essential for this event, I would like to offer our warm welcome to all participants. This is the 7th year of the Forum, and the first year, as Hugh said, that we're holding it as a virtual event. Indeed, we will miss seeing everyone in person, but we're very happy to extend Forum participation to an even broader audience. And I think Hugh mentioned that registrations are over 3,000. We're very pleased and hope you will all be tuning in now or after with the recording. We encourage you to explore the platform and website for the Forum, where you'll find highlights on 2 OECD reports being released today and information on the event sponsors. To maximize interactions, we encourage you to use the platform to network, respond to polls, and provide your comments and questions. The comments section provides a good opportunity to exchange. Please use it to make connections, share ideas about relevant initiatives. We will select a handful of what we think are the most relevant questions to share with the moderator, and we'll try our best to keep up with the questions and comments, but surely other participants will offer their answers as well. And also remember, you can copy and paste questions and comments for future reference and follow up with us and other participants. Many thanks, and now back to Hugh and the Secretary General to start the opening plenary.
Great, thanks, Rob. It is, as Rob mentioned now, my great pleasure to welcome to the Forum Mr. Angel Gurria, Secretary General of the OECD, and Angel is going to give the brief opening keynote and welcome remarks to this event. Just to intro him quickly, he has firmly established the OECD as a pillar of the global economic governance architecture, including the G7, G20 and APEC. And it's very much become a reference point in the design and implementation of better policies for better lives, which has been one of their driving agenda items. He's also heralded a new growth narrative that promotes the well-being of people, including women, gender and youth, and has scaled up the OECD contribution to the global agenda, including very much the Paris Agreement on climate change and the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals. Secretary General Gurria, this year, the digital floor is yours. It's great to see you and have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. All that. And we're all fans of Hugh Whelan. Huh? So welcome to this 7th OECD Forum on Green Finance and Investment. And let me thank our main sponsor, the government of Japan, for their continuing support for the forum and OECD work on green finance and investment more generally. Also, thank you to Iberdrola and our other sponsors for their support for this year's forum, as well as a media sponsor, ResponsibleInvestor.com, and its co-founder, Hugh Whelan, who joins us again as chair. Now, this year's forum inevitably focuses on perspectives for green finance and investment in a COVID-19 and a post-COVID-19 world. The pandemic has triggered a health and economic crisis of a magnitude never seen before. Every single OECD economy suffered a sharp drop in economic activity in the second quarter of 2020, with the annualized rate of decline ranging from 12% to as much as 60% for that second quarter. Although the initial rebound from that drop will generally be rapid, it will only be partial. For the full year, our interim economic outlook last month projected that global GDP will fall by 4.5%. Will fall by 4.5%. There'll be a contraction of the world's economy of 4.5%. By far the worst annual outcome since we've been projecting economic outcomes, 60 years ago, just to put it in perspective. Moreover, after the initial partial rebound, which was inevitable, we expect the rest of the recovery to be a hard slog, at least until an effective vaccine or treatment is found. Many countries will have a prolonged period of high unemployment and widespread hardship. Now, the economic impact of the pandemic means that CO2 emissions are expected to drop by around 8% this year. But the IPCC says that they must continue to decline at that rate every year until 2030 if we are to stand a good chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. That is much harder to do once growth has resumed. But somehow we need to make it happen. Now, of course, we are not saying we're going to have a COVID every year. And at the same time, what we need to do is to say, and that gives you an idea of how difficult it is that we have to replicate the outcomes in terms of emissions without replicating the COVID. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to make that happen? We're also destroying biodiversity and ecosystem services as an unprecedented rate. We have already altered 3/4 of the world's terrestrial surface, 2/3 of the marine environment, while the populations of mammals, birds, fish, amphibians, and reptiles have declined on average by 68% in the last 50 years, since 1970. Moreover, policies are often exacerbating the situation, meaning official policies, government policies. For example, OECD analysis shows that pre-crisis, spending to protect, promote, defend biodiversity was around, on average about 85 billion a year. While government support to activities that are harmful to biodiversity exceeded about 6 times that. So 500 billion per year. So with one hand, we're trying to rebuild. With the other, we are hurting it 6 times more. Meanwhile, 70% of energy-related CO2 emissions from advanced and emerging economies are entirely untaxed. Some of the most polluting fuels remain among the least taxed. We're doing everything like upside down, the wrong way. So no surprise, we're getting bad outcomes. Some governments have recognized the urgency of these challenges by including green measures in their recovery policy packages, as you can see on the Green Recovery page of the OECD's website. These measures include grants, loans, tax relief directed towards green transport, the circular economy, financial support for energy efficiency improvements, renewable energy, many others. When you support the car industry, but you support it in a differentiated way, you give one-time support or maybe no support to diesel cars, one-time support to gasoline cars, maybe double the support to hybrids and triple the support to fully electric. This is what happened here in France, for example, and it's a type of issues the type of things that make sense and one can understand. People can understand them also. Now, unfortunately, some countries are implementing measures that are likely to have a negative impact on the environment. For example, rolling back existing environmental regulations, unconditional bailouts of emissions-intensive companies, and increased subsidies to fossil fuels-intensive infrastructure. So again, undoing with one hand, but with a multiple, what we're trying to do with the other. We need to do much more to address these challenges. Public resources committed to green measures must be used strategically to mobilize private capital. Leveraging private investment for infrastructure, for example, is a critical pillar of the transition to a low carbon resilient economy, as reflected by the OECD-wide initiative on sustainable infrastructure. But to do this, we need a detailed understanding of where and how investment is taking place. So for the first time, we can offer a granular mapping. A new report is called Green Infrastructure in the Decade for Delivery, Assessing Institutional Investment. You know, this is a very handsome presentation here. It's being launched at this forum. And it shows that institutional investors hold an estimated 1 trillion in infrastructure assets. And of course, this sounds a lot, but it amounts to only 4% of the theoretical limit. And, you know, given current regulations, but also of that 1 trillion, only 30% of the 1 trillion can be attributed to green infrastructure.
Secretary General, I just wanted to jump in because we have the Minister on a hard stop at 10:30, so just to remind.
Very good. So perhaps maybe, Hugh, let me just say we have the other development, sustainable finance definitions and taxonomies, which is the other publication we're going to present this time around. And let me just say, dear friends, the environmental crises that are gathering will not pause while we battle the pandemic. We need to ensure that the way we recover from this crisis does not make the next one worse. So we count on you, the policymakers, the regulators, the investors, experts, and civil society representatives to move this agenda forward. Count on the OECD to support you in your efforts. Only by working together can we build back better and achieve a green recovery. So thank you.
Great. Secretary General Gurria, thank you very much indeed for a characteristically passionate and pertinent introduction to this conference. We're now going to switch into our high-level opening plenary session on can green finance objectives be achieved despite the COVID-19 pandemic, which Secretary General Gurria just alluded to, and the problems and challenges that we face ahead. Just before we do, a quick reminder to you to drop your questions for the panelists into the questions section on the site, and the team here will feed those questions to me, and we'll get through as many of those as we can. A thanks again to the Secretary General for being here and for hosting this event. Thank you very much, Secretary General Gurria. We are now going to come a little bit closer to home, to where I'm sitting, and it's my real pleasure to introduce the Right Honourable Kwasi Kwarteng, Minister of State at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy here in the UK. Part of his portfolio is green finance, and it's great to have the Minister here. I'm going to hand over to him now. He's got a hard stop at 10:30. So, Minister, thank you very much for being here, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. It's a real pleasure to be speaking at this forum. I'd also like to thank the OECD Secretary General Gurria for his passionate and very lucid speech and very lucid account of where we are with respect to the growing emergency of climate change. I'd like to also thank the Centre on Green Finance and Investment for convening this event. In these unprecedented times, global leadership is needed to put us on a path to a green and resilient recovery. As we move towards COP26 and our G7 presidencies, it is a pleasure to be speaking to the private and public sector players that are well placed to support us globally to build back better and greener. As the Prime Minister set out in his speech on the 30th of June, we intend to build back better, build back greener, and to do this at the pace that the moment requires. The UK, I think, has shown that green and economic growth, green development rather, and economic growth are not contradictory. In fact, they are well aligned. Since 1990, we in the UK have grown our economy by 75%, while at the same time, we have managed to cut emissions by 43%. The UK today has over 460,000 jobs in low carbon businesses and their supply chains. We intend, and we think this is absolutely achievable, we intend by 2030 to have 2 million such jobs, which represents a fourfold increase. As the UK takes up the COP presidency, we need to make sure that every professional financial decision takes climate change fully into account. To move from billions of investment to trillions, we will need all finance to align with the Paris Agreement. And in order to achieve this, disclosure of climate financial risk has to be comprehensive, climate risk management has to be transformed, and investment for a net zero world has to be firmly in the mainstream of finance. That's why I am very pleased that the Prime Minister has asked Mark Carney to be an advisor on finance for COP26. And our government here in the UK is advancing the implementation of the TCFD recommendations here in the UK and in the wider world. Through our green finance strategy, we have been very clear about our priorities and where we want to focus. There is an emphasis on establishing robust policy frameworks, improving access to finance for green investments, and also addressing market barriers as well. We've set out a clear signal to investors in our commitment to net zero by 2050. This approach has seen over £94 billion invested in clean energy in the United Kingdom since 2010. Looking forward, we are investing in priority areas, including low carbon transport infrastructure, energy efficiency, sustainable land use, and nature-based projects. This includes provision of carefully designed public support to make sure we capture enough private capital, attract enough private capital so that we can have even more profitable investment. Since March, we have announced billions in support of the green economic recovery. Notable announcements include the £3 billion Green Homes Grant and a £2 billion package for cycling and walking, and funds which we hope will support sustainable innovation as well as reforestation in Britain. From the point of view of COVID-19 and green growth, it's been estimated that $10 to $20 trillion is expected to be invested in global recovery efforts from COVID-19. It's absolutely critical that countries align their COVID-19 recovery planning with Paris Agreement goals. And among these goals, there should be an end to international finance for coal power and a commitment to ensure that every country which considers new power generation naturally looks at, in the first instance, clean power. We've got to make clean power the most attractive option. Global investors managing $12 trillion are demanding a sustainable recovery. IRENA's recent report suggested that renewable energy investments following COVID-19 could generate GDP gains of nearly 100 trillion. it's critical we work with the OECD and others to create momentum to unlock the potential behind these figures. Since June 2020, the UK has committed over £150 million to support sustainable recovery efforts across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. It's absolutely vital that we continue this very important work in developing countries to make sure that everybody, and not just rich, wealthy countries, can benefit from the green recovery. As incoming COP26 president, we hope to build on a wider collaboration with partners, friends, and countries across the world. Internationally, it will be important for us to encourage countries to focus action on our 5 COP26 priority areas, namely adaptation and resilience, nature, energy, transport, and finance. And we fully expect and hope that countries will come forward with enhanced, nationally determined contributions and long-term strategies before COP26 starts. We will use our COP26 presidency to encourage donor countries to come together to demonstrate good progress on our commitment to mobilize $100 billion in climate finance for developing countries on an annual basis. We will also use our presidency to help make the global financial system more adapted for a greener and more resilient future. In conclusion, I'd like to thank the OECD Center on Green Finance and Investment, and to thank all the participants on this call. I can think of no more important issue in the international arena today. And I look forward to working with all of you to redouble our efforts to make sure that we can use finance to achieve a cleaner, greener future. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you very much indeed for that. Great to have you here. Just before you have to jump off, it would be wonderful. We had a fascinating announcement this morning from the government in the UK about wind power, really encouraging. But at the same time, we've had some developments on the coal financing side in the UK. What are people to make of where the UK is at the moment in the balancing act of progressing clean energy versus existing fossil fuel energy?
I think our story on fossil fuels is very, very clear and positive. I mean, if I look at the role that coal played in the UK's economic development, and I look at where it is now, I mean, it's been one of the most extraordinary reversals, the extraordinary achievements. So in terms of the bold facts, we are essentially reducing coal to zero. Coal will play no part in electricity generation in the UK. And you have to consider that in the UK, we were, until the 1950s, we were mining roughly 250 million tons a year of coal. So that's the equivalent of 1 million tons a day. And we've gone from 1 million tons a day 60 years ago to almost nothing. With regard to the coal that you're mentioning, I think this is a very small development, and it's limited to coal which is used in industrial purposes. But broadly, we are still committed even to eliminating that in the medium term. So I think the story of coal in the UK has been extraordinary in terms of the dominance it once had, and to the point where today it's of very little account.
And of course, that's something that we wind power this morning as well at home.
Yeah, I mean, the wind power I think was extraordinary. Again, wind power is something which here in the UK we're very proud of. We've developed, I think, capacity. I think it's about 1/3 of the global capacity in offshore wind is here in the UK. And we've managed through the auction process to reduce the price of that power generation by about 3/4. So it started off at about £150 per megawatt hour and is now about £40 per megawatt hour. So there have been great strides in this. And I think the Prime Minister's announcement really should drive a lot of that momentum and help us consolidate, the considerable achievements we've already made.
Minister, thank you very much indeed. It bodes well for leadership on the COP26 conference, and we look forward to seeing developments on that side as well. Great to have you here today.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time. And
sorry I have to go, but I wish you all the success in the world. I think it's going to be a great few days for you.
Thanks very much indeed, Minister. Look forward to speaking again soon.
Thank you.
Our next speaker after the Minister is Lawrence Boone. Lawrence is Chief Economist at the OECD, and she also supervises the contributions of the OECD's Economics Department to the new approaches to economic challenges initiative, which is great, and the inclusive growth initiatives as well across the OECD, both vital elements of the work the OECD is doing. She is the Secretary General's spokesperson on economic issues and serves as the OECD representative at the deputies meeting of the G20 finance track. It's my great pleasure to hand over now to Lawrence Boone, Chief Economist here at the OECD, for some introductory remarks, and then we will go through our first set of panelists on this discussion before we move in to more discursive Q&A. Lawrence, over to you.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here. I think it's an extremely interesting forum which I had the honor of attending last year. So I'm very pleased to be back with you. It's also a great honor to speak after the Secretary General and the Minister. And I'm the only one to have a green background, but that is to show how much we believe into this. I've shared my screen. Can you confirm that you can see the...
Yeah, absolutely. Looks great. So we have screen shared.
You can see the PowerPoint, right?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. So let me start. I will focus exactly, as a follow-up to what the Secretary General and the Minister were saying on how the exceptional circumstances we are going through actually make the environmental issue even more important. And the first part is, I think, we have had a dramatic period last year. The coronavirus pandemic has taken everybody aback, and it has hurt the world economy in an unprecedented way. And even so, the economic outlook really remains exceptionally uncertain, with the COVID-19 pandemic continuing to exert a substantial toll on economies and societies. We are facing the most dramatic economic slowdown since the Second World War. What you can see on the chart is that the second quarter of 2020 was marked by the necessary strict lockdowns and the restrictions that were put in place to contain the spread of the COVID-19 in many countries worldwide. And obviously these measures and the length of the pandemic are changing people's behavior. So we had a sharp contraction in activity, a strong rebound in those activities that could recover. But what is the most striking with this picture is we only get a partial recovery. The period ahead of us is even more challenging than the confinement. We're going to have to live with an activity worldwide that is between 5 to 10% below what we were used to see prior to the virus. And that's because we will continue to have containment, by perhaps targeted lockdown, some activities being impaired as people's health requires physical distancing. And the best proof of this is that we're still doing a Zoom meeting and we are not all meeting together physically. So what we're trying to focus on, thank you for highlighting this focus of the OECD on people in our last economic outlook, was really to explain what this is meaning for people, but also for jobs and for companies. And the strongest message we wanted to send is policy do matter, and they do matter a lot. It was important in the crisis, it's going to be even more important in this phase, which the Secretary General described, where we have to live with the virus for 1 to 2 years. We don't know when the end will be. And so policy will be needed not only to help put our economies on a growth track, but to ensure that they are back on a better and more sustainable growth than before. We strongly believe that we missed this opportunity in the aftermath of the great financial crisis. Today, people have huge expectations and we cannot miss it again. So what does building better, more sustainable economies, more resilient, with less inequality mean? And I think the crisis, it's important to bear in mind, has widened already inequality. Well, as I was saying, first, we're in a period of unprecedented uncertainty, which is linked both to the future path of the virus, development of treatment or vaccine, but also, I think this is also linked to the nonlinear and complex nature of climate change. And also there's uncertainty on the pace and the magnitude of what climate change means for the world. I think it's fair to say that some effects are already palatable. For example, we're already seeing some damages from climate change. Think about the wildfire in the region of California. Higher temperatures are already disrupting the life of many, forcing migration in some places. And also the natural, more generally climate-related catastrophes are on the rise. We showed that in the previous economic outlook. Then the ESG talked about protecting biodiversity, and I think that's also something that we should focus on, but he's mentioned it, so I'm jumping on something, which is that, researchers had been warning us of the risks of a global pandemic for a while. And I think in turn, this pandemic should remind us about the importance of public policies to reduce the risks of and prepare for uncertain adverse global shocks requiring long-term commitment, and that is particularly specific of climate-related risk. But we're obviously facing a tragedy of the horizon, because there's a mismatch between the short-term horizon of decision now and the longer-term horizon of climate change and the associated socio-economic impact. But yet again, the pandemic should remind us that fat-tail risks can create large and unforeseen costs in the long run, but also in the present. So I mentioned uncertainty several times, and that's why I put this slide up, and I'm going to talk about this a little more now. We don't think at the OECD that there's a unique solution to deal with the uncertainty that's associated with a health and environmental crisis. No one size fits all countries or one block of policies. But what we do know is that investment and uncertainty do not go well together. And that chart is reminding us of this. That's why policymakers need to express a very clear determination when they're laying out their policies. And when I'm saying that, I'm saying providing certainty on environmental regulation, on fiscal issues, and that these two are really necessary to unlock private investment. What do I mean more practically? Well, first, uncertainty increases when there are other changes in policy, like abolishing or withdrawing from environmental treaties, and that uncertainty may have effects over a very long period of time. So we're actually looking at this and trying to quantify this at the OECD. There's a vast array of literature that shows that. But for example, if you look at the chart, bear in mind that the uncertainty created by the virus has reduced the production of investment goods by 30% during the first semester of this year. And investment is still about 15% below its pre-crisis level. And what's more is the recovery in investment has started plateauing. This is super important because investment in infrastructure have a long life shelf. 15 years for solar panel, for example, 50 years for nuclear plants, 100 years for transport infrastructure. And that brings me to the recovery plan and how policymakers can actually unlock green finance and investment while supporting a green recovery. So we hear a lot about this, green fiscal recovery packages. And we start seeing a few countries publishing their recovery plan. We heard the UK minister, we had the French budget, but we're still waiting for those recovery plan. And I think it will be very important to look at them with great scrutiny to see how much they are actually dedicating about these sustainability issues. So in the short run, the first message I would like to give, and this refers to the uncertainties, do no harm. Since the crisis, there have been moves to dismantle some of the environmental policies and instead support fossil fuel industry, and often with little conditionality. While this can undermine trust in whether policymakers are serious about climate change mitigation. So the third thing is avoid these environmental changes and avoid locking in carbon-intensive technologies. The second thing is prioritize public spending. Yes, we need fiscal stimulus and support to boost the recovery, but we need to do it right. Public efforts should focus on projects that have a very strong public good component. That's health, education, of course, but also low carbon infrastructure projects, energy storage, smart grids, without it, no renewable energy, charging stations for electric vehicle, renewables deployment, and digital technology, because as I was saying, this is the pillar of the deployment of green investment. Now, some OECD analysis indicates that OECD member governments have committed about 300 billion of public resources to green recovery. Frankly, given the amount of money that is being sent to support the economy at the current juncture, this is very little. There are too much money and too much measures that are going into non-green spending, such as fossil fuel investment. You can see it on the right-hand side. The amount of money that's being spent on fossil fuel in the recovery plan so far, in the support plan, I should say so far, is more than what is spent on renewable power, energy efficiency, or energy storage. So we should remember that, and we should read through the governments should actually pay attention, and more than that, dedicate money to renewable energy in their and green investment in their budget, 2021 budget.
Lawrence, I'm keen that we bring in some of our other speakers before we come back to some of this, so just to let you know, but I'm interested, there's a question that's come in actually, which is very relevant, I think, to that big brown stack that we see there, fossil fuels without climate targets, and it's how do we optimize the transition of that big stack into the other somewhat smaller stacks that we see there? How should that be done best?
So I think there are three elements. One is really the regulatory environment, the regulation, that provides incentive for changing. The second is public investment. To let you a little into the intimacy of the OECD, we were discussing this morning with the Secretary General precisely this issue. Countries need to rebuild the capacity of having long-term planning investment projects. Quite often, and especially in countries where you have several layers of government, the capacity to invest, the staff, the human skills, the capacity to process long-term investment has been lost. This crisis is the unique opportunity of rebuilding it, planning slowly dephasing fossil fuel support, but with compensation packages for the people who are the most affected by it, and at the same time building gradually the investment into cleaner energy. And the reason why I was mentioning digital so much is, we can have renewable energy on the one hand producing energy, but we know that it's not a regular flow of energy. and we can have the consumption in front of it, and they cannot match all the time. That's why we need the digital grid to make sure to optimize what's coming out of energy production with energy consumption. The reason why I mentioned compensation package as well is we know that carbon taxes are important price signal to unlock green investment, but we also know that it's politically very difficult to implement. So we at the OECD are looking into ways of designing the right compensation package for the people who are hurt by the removal of fossil fuel subsidies. And that's super important to make it acceptable and to embark everybody into climate change, and to also make sure that, you know, the distributional effect of removing one taxes to add another one are well taken into account. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. Thanks for that, Laurence. It's really great to have an insight into the granular thinking that you're doing with the OECD in terms of how to unlock these challenges. If it's okay with you, we're going to move on to our next speaker and then come back to some of the points that you have, just in the interest of just making sure we have an equal time access, but we'll come back to those. Unless there's a point you want to make before we hand over.
No, I think actually you've asked the question which I was covering in my last part. So, I mean, even so we didn't coordinate, I think that was right on spot. Thank you.
Okay, that's lovely. Thanks for that, Laurence. Great presentation, great insights into the work you're doing. We're going to hand over now to Inge Andersen. And if we could just take off the screen so we have, and we are really thrilled to have Inge Andersen, Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme, with us here today. Inge was appointed to her current role by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres back in February 2019. And prior to that, between 2015 and 2019, Inge was the Director General of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, and she's also held a number of leadership roles in the World Bank and the United Nations. Inge, over to you for your introductory presentation, and then we'll circle back on some of the points that we've heard from Laurence and from you. Inge, great to have you here.
Well, fine. Thank you so much, Hugh, and to Angel. Thank you for the leadership. You are really, sometimes I wonder, should you be at UNEP? Because you really have, you're flying that green flag, that sustainability flag, which we really, really appreciate. Thank you very, very much. Look, I mean, we all know that the pandemic, and we've heard before, is part of these. And at UNEP, we speak about 3 planetary crises, not one. Yes, the climate crisis, but I was so pleased to hear Angela also speak about the nature and biodiversity crisis. But let us not forget the pollution and waste crisis. And so these 3, they are essentially destroying the nature and the natural system that allow our very economies to thrive. Over the decades, there have been many commitments to tackle these 3 crises, and COVID-19 has shown that whatever we're doing, we're not doing it at sufficient speed, with sufficient force, with sufficient commitment to meet these goals that we have set for ourselves. So yes, we need to stretch and be ambitious in goals, but that's not enough. We actually need to stretch action and implementation and financing and redirecting to match what we have agreed. And this means that for the public and the private finance sector, that monies have to start flowing to the right places. And we have all heard many times that pandemic recovery chances provides that chance to start a process that we are now seeing, because we are seeing this, as we heard from Laurence also, this unprecedented flow of monies from the public purse, from the taxpayers' funding, from you and I, from our money, into the economy. And that is a fine thing. And yes, initially it needs to go in to cut checks and support healthcare and education. But what would be unforgivable, because recall please that we are borrowing from tomorrow. Recall please that many governments are borrowing to make this money available today. And so it would be unforgivable if we not only saddle the next generation with an unsustainable environment and nature that has collapsed and a pollution crisis, but also with a debt. So let's recall then that what we need to do, it's so glaringly obvious, it's so self-evident, these $20 trillion or more that we are and that we will be pumping into the economy to recover must be part of that shift to greener, cleaner, and sustainable. So Money alone, though, is not enough to get the job done. We need finance, and public money alone is not enough. We need private finance to mobilize these trillions. And I want to draw your attention to the emerging insight from the Dasgupta review. If you like, that is about the economics of biodiversity, led by Professor Partha Dasgupta. And I have the privilege of being on the advisory committee. It will be issued by Her Majesty's Treasury later this year, and it illustrates this. The initial findings from the review shows that for humanity to live in harmony with nature, we need a global financial system that invests in enhancing natural assets. As Gupta says, we need to think of nature as an asset class to help mitigate risks from biodiversity loss and natural capital depletion. And we are far from that system. Global estimates of financial flows support natural asset ranges from $78 billion to $143 billion per year. OECD estimates that governments spend $500 billion on the subsidies, and Angel was just speaking about this very point. But let's understand that we can't push nature into a corner. We've altered about 76% of the terrestrial surface, more than 60% of the marine surface. We're pushing nature into a corner, and we expect that it'll just supply, that it'll just regulate our weather, and that it'll just harvest will follow harvest, and season will follow season. We can't make those assumptions. So we need to ensure that this class of assets, including nature, not just climate, is protected. So I have basically 4 points that we need to take attention to. One, obviously, commitments from financial institutions must be science-based. And when I say science-based, I mean understanding truly the science. That's where we come in, and many other good partners here. For example, UNEP's financial initiative, UNEP-FI, engages with investors who represent about $5 trillion in assets under the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. And that alliance relies heavily on the IPCC, on the especially on the 1.5 report, but on any number of other areas to help set intermediate and long-term targets. And then we work closely between the scientific community and the financial community to help identify sectoral emission pathways for investments. And such credible sectoral pathways to zero climate impact need to be applied to everything from steel to cement to manufacture, aviation, energy, agriculture. This is the obvious way, but we've got to base it in science. Secondly, action needs to be portfolio and institution-wide in line with international processes. There are a number of institutions and financial institutions out there who are quite opportunistic. Ad hoc green bits are added onto the portfolio here and there, but otherwise the stock of the portfolio, the primary stock, remains toxic, gray, and dirty, and counterproductive. That's not good enough. We need to take an all-of-portfolio approach, and organizations and investment houses need to be very consistent about this across sectors and, yes, across geographies. You can't export the industry elsewhere and have a clean portfolio at home. They need to be in line with Paris, in line with SDG, in line with biodiversity commitments, etc. And here, just a plug for us to understand that we cannot just talk about environment and think that talking about renewable is it. That is a slice like this of a size like that. We need to understand that the entirety of the Earth's systems are dependent on us working with the entirety of the environmental rainbow. And that means the climate crisis, the nature crisis, and the pollution crisis. And understand that what is driving these crises is our unsustainable production and consumption. So therefore, it is around circularity that we have to invest. 3, transparency and accountability are essential. And I just want to give you an example about what it is that we are doing through the Principles for Responsible Banking. Under these principles, 190 banks, representing about 40% of global banking assets, serving 1.6 billion customers, have committed to align their business strategies and practices with the SDGs and with Paris. The principles then require third-party review and annual reports, third-party reviewed annual reports, and provide assurance that what is being reported is actually happening. And that gives investors a degree of surety, as well as the general public, so that greenwashing or these bits in your portfolio cannot happen. It has to be consistent across. Adhering to these three practices that I've mentioned, science-based, portfolio-wide, and transparency, will go a long way for the finance industry to get to the right direction. And understanding that we're dealing with three things, three crises. And I very much am so pleased that in this forum, we're having this discussion. We encourage all banks, insurers, investors, and all actors in the finance ecosystem around the world to join the UN in making the finance sector fit for financing the needs for society and for sustainable development outcomes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for that, and applause from the Secretary General. I guess applause all round, really, virtual applause that we can't hear, but thanks for getting very much to the point. There are some questions that come up from that, but I'd like to come back to them after we hear from Tracy, and it's a real pleasure to have Tracy Crowe here with us. Tracy is Chief of Staff and Director of Internal Programs at Sustainable Energy for All, often initiated to SE for All. She has hauled herself out of bed at the unholy hour of 4 o'clock this morning. She's based out of Washington, DC, and has a diverse background in international relations, clean energy, carbon markets, and communications, and she successfully managed the Secretariat for the Clean Energy Ministerial when it was hosted at the US Department of Energy. Tracy, it's great to have you here, and thanks for being here so early in the morning, your time. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh, and thank you to the Secretary General and to the OECD for organizing this important dialogue on green finance and investment. SE for All collaborates closely with the OECD on several initiatives, notably our flagship Energizing Finance research series that tracks finance commitments for energy access in developing countries. And just to note, the new Energizing Finance report will be coming out in about another month, so please do be looking out for that. So let me take this opportunity to commend the OECD's leadership on its contributions to sustainable development and climate change, not least through placing finance at the heart of this agenda. Our key priority at SE for All is to support countries in accelerating their energy transitions in line with the Paris Agreement and in a way that puts us on a path to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 7, and that's access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all by 2030. We simply cannot deliver a net zero energy transition by 2050 without first providing sustainable energy for all by 2030. And we can't do that without ensuring that sufficient appropriate finance flows to energy access in developing countries. These really are unprecedented times that require transformative efforts and new commitments towards a global energy compact that leaves no one behind. We owe it to the 789 million people who lack access to electricity and the 2.8 billion people who lack access to clean cooking solutions. The COVID-19 pandemic has really brought into even more stark relief how critical access to energy is for lives and for livelihoods. From better healthcare and education to employment growth to sustainable cooling and food security, access to energy is the key to unlock a more promising future for billions of people worldwide. So governments have a unique, once-in-a-generation opportunity to recover better from the pandemic while they close energy access gaps and create long-term economic growth. Countries that take advantage of this moment to invest in renewable energy and energy efficiency and clean cooking and efficient and sustainable cooling and local value chains can develop, we think, a competitive advantage. To that end, SE for All has been releasing over the last few months a series of Recover Better with Sustainable Energy Guides. We've released one for Africa, for the Caribbean. We have one coming out for Southeast Asia, and another coming out for Latin America later this year. These guides highlight the benefits and the enablers for countries as they respond to this crisis. Investing in a green recovery really does promise multiple benefits: GDP growth, job creation, cheaper energy provisions, and better outcomes for healthcare and gender equality. With renewables now cheaper to deploy at scale than fossil fuels in many markets around the world, it makes economic, environment, and social sense to invest in clean energy to stimulate economic growth, close energy access gaps, and support livelihoods. Our research has found that investments in clean energy produce about 3 times the number of jobs as the same investments in fossil fuels. And for every dollar invested in the transition towards renewable energy, an additional 93 cents of GDP growth is expected to occur. So it really does make you wonder when we're seeing these numbers that we've heard from a few people now of so much of the recovery money going towards fossil fuels. Why, when we can see so many benefits for investing in renewable energy? But again, in spite of this encouraging outlook, we are continuing to see a rise in fossil fuel-related investments and the continuance of fossil fuel subsidies. And this is at the same time that finance for clean energy and energy access continues to fall woefully short. So governments, we think, must take this opportunity to prioritize emissions-free, non-coal-fired electricity generation as part of their integrated energy planning, and prioritize least cost solutions that avoid leaving stranded assets to the next generation of decision makers. For power generation, over half of all coal plants currently in operation cost more to run than building new renewables. Countries should focus on large-scale investments in renewables, including both centralized and decentralized technologies. For the majority of the people without access to electricity, off-grid solutions, mini-grids, and solar home systems are those least cost solutions. These investments should also drive the development of the upstream value chain so that countries also build local manufacturing or assembly of equipment used in renewable projects. This will create jobs and contribute to greater energy security. And of course, finance has to be at the heart of these solutions. International public finance institutions must exercise their mandate to fill continuing financing gaps for sustainable energy access in countries with the largest access deficits. We must also focus on strengthening international cooperation to mobilize the long-term and the large-scale finance needed to meet SDG 7 and the Paris Agreement. At SA for All, we're contributing to a number of key international dialogues to ensure there is the necessary high-level commitment to drive action. One example is our work supporting the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as this year's G20 presidency. And we do commend the leadership of the G20 members in recognizing the importance of energy access and their recent endorsement of a G20 initiative on clean cooking. But now that needs to translate into action to back up that endorsement. I also want to highlight our work supporting the UK government's COP26 energy transition campaign, and also want to highlight the UN's high-level dialogue on energy that will take place in 2021. The high-level dialogue represents the first global gathering on energy called for by the General Assembly in 40 years. So the high-level dialogue and COP26 present us as a global community with a historic opportunity for transformational action. But I do want to stress that these are more than just events. They do represent opportunities for countries, companies, international institutions to demonstrate political commitment at the highest levels, to make concrete and trackable commitments through energy compacts in support of energy access and a clean energy transition. In summary, I would just say that now is really the right time for leaders to strengthen their resolve in committing to a just energy transition that leaves no one behind, and to the volume of green finance and investment that must sit behind it. Thank you very much.
Tracy, thanks very much indeed for that. While we've got you on, actually, I wanted to get a sense, going back to the COVID-19 title of these presentations and discussions, how far are you seeing clean energy remits at the forefront of recovery measures or not at the moment? Can you give us some examples of what looks hopeful, where you'd like to see more encouraging signs?
So starting with the less than hopeful, again, is what we've heard already today, is the the investment in fossil fuels that's overwhelming the investments in clean energy. We've been also trying to track this, including through the OECD site. There's an energy policy tracker that's, I think, done by Columbia University, and it's showing similar things, almost double the investment in fossil fuels as clean energy from the G20 members. So this is tracking just G20 members. But there are good signs as well. The UK highlighted what they're doing, so that's very positive. One of the things that we would highlight is what's going on in Nigeria. And we've seen commitments in that country that would seriously have been unthinkable just 6 months ago. So they have their own green recovery plan that's out now. And as part of that, they announced that they're eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. And this is for a major oil and gas nation. So this is very significant. They've also put energy access at the heart of their plan. And if you look at the plan, you'll see there's a commitment to deliver 5 million solar connections. So they're really taking seriously using the Green Recovery Plan to address their energy access gaps, but also do it in a way that's going to create economic opportunity. At that 5 million solar plan and the things that they've got in the plan is expected to create 250,000 new jobs. They're also looking at building the upstream value chain and looking at how can they bring large-scale assembly into the country and create even more jobs. So that's just one highlight, but that's a significant one.
Great, thanks for that, Tracy. I'm wondering actually if the SG is still there. Angela, are you still there? Do you want to respond to what you've heard so far? If you are, I can't quite see if you're there or not, but if you're not, then we'll go over to a poll, but we'd had to interrupt your flow earlier on. So I don't think he is, but we will try and bring the Secretary General back in anyway for some responses on this. But we'd like to launch a poll before we go back into our speakers. And we heard Inga talk earlier about the value of biodiversity in this discussion, and of course the whole area of how much ecosystem services bring to our economies. And I'd like to launch a poll just to ask you, the audience, what you think the value of biodiversity and ecosystem services delivered each year is. And if we could just tee up that poll. There are 4 possible answers: A, $100 billion, B, $1 trillion, C, $10 trillion, or D, $100 trillion. Hopefully we have the poll launching now. I don't know. Hopefully you can see it. I can't see it, but just in case we don't, polling is always the most problematic part of any conference that I've done live. It looks like we don't have that, but I'm going to go back to our speakers. It's in the tab nest to the Q&A apparently, so maybe you can see the results or see the poll. I don't know, I'm flying a little bit blind here, but we'll go back to our speakers. Lawrence, I wondered actually, there's a question here that talks about, and I'd like to bring Inga in here a bit more as well, how the finance sector can take some of the data that you presented earlier and think about what the potential is now for cross-sector transformation. And we've heard this discussion for a long time about mobilizing private sector money. And yet we're still in a situation where private sector mobilization here is still far too small. So what's the opportunity out there for investors that are tuned into this conference, people in the finance world, banking, insurance, etc., based on how governments are now responding? I think we're seeing some serious changes out there. What should they be tuned into in terms of thinking about where opportunities are? I mean, obviously financiers are both looking at the potential for putting capital to work as well as the risk side of things.
No, so I think you're right. There is huge opportunity, as also Inga and Tracy were reminding us. But A couple of things for me. I mean, I've talked about regulation consistency, and I think that's super important. We have actually, there are two things there. One is we have actually published a paper that shows that, environmental related regulation is not harming productivity and employment, rather the opposite. And that's evidence-based analysis, admittedly on the existing regulation, which is not enough widespread, but that's important. So regulation is not an enemy of green finance. It's actually a friend of green finance as long as it's stable, because it cannot change all the time. The other thing which is super important is we talked about carbon pricing. You have this climate coalition of finance minister, and that's one of the things that everybody is focusing on. And why is it important? Because you will only get infrastructure and energy industry to actually invest in more renewable energy and greener energy if they know that they will have to pay a price if they don't do otherwise, especially at a time where fossil fuel energy is so cheap. And again, it's not OECD being green activist at all, because we are really deeply looking into this issue of how to make it work. Also for the one who earn less money, need their car to go to work, cannot use public transport, or the small firms for which energy is an important input. There are studies out there. It's possible to actually put the nudge in place, get the change in behavior, and not have the distributional effect. But these prices, I think, are key. Now, two recent encouraging things. One is European, which is the taxonomy of the EU, which is progressing, taking different shades of green and brown, and that's important because that will allow to have the same accounting exercise across companies, and that will make it easier for investors to recognize where they're putting their money. And the third thing, I think, is the signal sent by central bank that they could actually change their collateral policy, they could change their QE policy, they could change their lending policy, plus the regulator of bank stability will actually look into what type of assets are lying on the balance sheet. So all these elements, we need more forceful action, but we can see that the evolution is moving. We didn't have the central banks issuing so many speeches on this issue last year. We have them now. We didn't have so much work on the political economy of carbon pricing and the focus on the distributional effect. We have some now, but we did have higher fossil fuel prices, so we must address that also now.
And do you
think, to me, this crisis, if there was a positive side of this crisis, it would be on the digital side. Not because you cannot do the poll, but because we can be there together, and that's easy to do. But this is a reminder that there's huge investment in digital to make, that it's hugely important for green infrastructure. And, if I had to compare it to something, it would be to remind us of the New Deal in the 1930s, where the focus at the time was on bringing energy and electricity to people and making all this energy-related infrastructure. I'm not saying we cannot do the same with energy, but I think the similar investment in digital are essential to unlock the green energy potential. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Laurence. So actually, I just wanted to come back to the point you made earlier, which was we missed the opportunity at the time of the financial crisis to get these changes in place. Why do you think this time is different? When people will be asking themselves, are we going to be waiting any longer for real change and real capital to start flowing? I mean, we know that we have 10 years max really to start actioning some really serious change in infrastructure, transportation, all of those areas.
So thanks. So that's a good question. I think for several reasons. The first one is, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, they were some attempts, but they were not coordinated, they were small, they were short-lived, and the price of some renewable collapsed. This time, the crisis has really an impact on our behavior, on our way of traveling, consuming, what we consume, and this will last for long because we're in there for quite a while, as we discussed earlier. So I do believe at this stage that we don't know what tomorrow will be like, but that the changes we're getting through, they will have a more permanent impact than the one of the last crisis. It's profoundly affecting the way we live. And I think there's more demand and more pressure on what's happening with the environment, not only because of the relationship between pandemic and biodiversity, but look at the political landscape, right? China is the biggest issuer of green bonds, or one of the big, and we don't really know what green means, but we are seeing the first green budget. The investment in the ambition of the European Union or the UK that we heard has grown up tremendously. The coalition of finance minister climate, 1 year ago, they were like a fourth of the number of ministers you have in there now. I think that there's been ups and downs, but the pressure has increased. People are more aware. It's more realistic too. It's not all about ambition. Now people realize how difficult it can be and how much work we have to do for this. But the mindset, it seems to me, both of policymakers, central bankers, and even us, has moved, has evolved.
Great, thanks for that, Laurence. I'm pleased to say that despite me not being able to see the poll actually was taking place, which is maybe a kind of a metaphor perhaps for some of the technology and policy changes that we hope are happening out of sight and gradually becoming more insight on climate. But just to let you know, so the question we asked you was, what is the value of biodiversity and ecosystems services delivered each year? 12.7% of you thought that the answer was 100 billion. 19% thought the answer was $1 trillion per annum. 46% thought that the answer was $10 trillion per annum. But of course, the answer is $100 trillion per annum, and 22% of you got that answer right. So well done to those who did guess correctly, and those who didn't may perhaps be surprised by the amount that nature provides to our economies. And it's a good way to segue into Inge actually on the same question, but posed slightly differently to you. You do some incredible work at UNEP with the finance industry, and you mentioned some of the points there on work that you're doing. But why do you feel, asking the same question, why do you feel now that things may be different, that you might be seeing policy changes starting to hang together, intentions starting to feel more direct? Give us a sense of where your hopes lie on the mobilizing of finance, and maybe where you think some of the barriers still are.
Well, I think after the 2008 crisis, there wasn't really, UNEP, my predecessor, did an excellent job, by the way, in trying to highlight the green economy and the green recovery in 2008. But it was considered more marginal. I think the overall awareness around climate change, certainly around nature, was not really at the same level of in the public domain amongst politicians than we have today. Today, with the SDGs and Paris Agreement, I think there's just all around a greater awareness. Now, you've then seen some market leaders, and we heard quoted from Laurence, the EU, that's obvious, but you also heard from Tracy what Nigeria is doing. Senegal, for example, has dropped the import tax on all elements to renewables. And so there's lots, and we could continue quoting lots of these really good examples. They're not as holistic as we would like them to be, but we are seeing countries making significant investments. Now, I am equally concerned about Laurence's brown column there. So we are not where we want to be, right? But what we can say is that where we have regulatory follow through, where we have also enforcement of standards, of the 50 mega cities, there are only 4 that have air quality standards in line with WHO. Is this the future we want? 7 million people dying prematurely of air-related diseases. So it's clearly not. So on the one hand, getting the regulatory setting and the enforcements in place, but 2, also frankly, today, much of these investments that were seen as riskier 10 years ago, 2008, 2009, are today, frankly, just they make sense. And everyone understands that coal and other hydrocarbons will be phased out. And so these are stranded assets sooner or later. And many of the institutional investors are stepping back. And then I think we are seeing that stimuli work. It actually works. If you look at 12 years ago, there was a little company called Tesla that got a little stimulus, and look where that took it. Now, so the point is that stimulus funding in the right direction can actually help countries take off. But I think the sort of, and one point I should say, the Energy Agency highlights that renewable investments year on year can generate these 9 million jobs. These are people who get jobs, get salaries, pay taxes, and help the economy roll. So investing is not just good for the climate, it's good for the all-round economy, obviously, and provides for the shareholders. And finally, when we see Kristalina Georgieva of IMF making it absolutely clear that their recovery packages will focus on that green economic recovery, will focus on job and climate resilience, on restoration, ecosystem restoration, on land degradation, on improved infrastructure. That gives us a degree of comfort, understanding that some of the biggest players in this field are actually getting it now. That was not the case in 2008. It was more of a marginal issue brought to the fore by some of the environmental organizations, including ourselves.
Any concerning that governments trying to fend off a second wave of COVID-19, or even a continuation of the first wave, will be sidetracked into these, onto the health side of things, of course, rather than focusing on both the health side of things and green recovery? Could it be a barrier to the things that we've raised already?
It's hard, right? I mean, if you're talking a low or middle income country that has only X amount of resources in their public budget, it's hard because they have to put health first. It's without a doubt, and no one would dispute that. But if they want to come back stronger, it is also about ensuring that they can put in place some of these incentives, regulatory in nature or otherwise, that can spur private sector investments in these fields. You don't need subsidies anymore for renewable. It's doing okay without it in most markets, and therefore it's often about ensuring that the regulatory settings and others are in place that can enable these to take off on the private sector side, feed-in tariffs, all of these things that we all know about. And so I think that's a concern. On the issue that we are concerned about is regression, so that there have been countries where environmental standards have regressed by by government action. That is clearly not okay. And I fear that these countries may end up losing market edge because the future is green. So you can look at countries like Morocco or Kenya that have been leaning into renewable for a decade, and that frankly are doing very, very well on solar in Morocco, geothermal and wind in Kenya. And these countries are having a much more steady supply of energy and are delivering for potential export to neighbors, etc. So I think that, and the last point I should say, what we are concerned, because I spoke about the waste and pollution crisis, and I'm going to insist on this, we are obviously concerned about, because there was an awareness around plastics and toxics nitrogen in our waterways. That awareness was rising, and that's a real issue. We're sucking chemicals in our soils, and that has very degrading impacts on our soils, our waterways, and on our oceans, and then the plastic things. And we had reached a level of awareness around plastic that with the PPE, unfortunately, in places where you don't have incineration, ends up in waterways, or even where people are careless. So not having regression there is a significant concern. Bottom line is we obviously need these PPEs now, but we need to think much more about circular design, from building material to infrastructure, etc. And obviously we need to deal with a deforestation-free agriculture, it goes without saying. And that's a huge investment opportunity as well.
Great point, Inga. The environment doesn't stop at CO2 emissions. Huge issues there, plastics, deforestation, that are all interlinked. We're going to come over to Tracy shortly. I'd like to just angle this question towards her, but just to let everyone know, the Secretary General had to go into another meeting. They're keeping him busy at the OECD this morning, as ever. He gave a big thumbs up before he left, and his thanks to all, and sorry he couldn't stay longer. We're going to go over to Tracy now. There's a question to come in from our audience, which I think is a really good one, actually, because the question asks, what are the incentives for the finance sector and the agencies represented in this meeting to discuss green recovery and economic growth that is more equitable? And I think that's an interesting question. You mentioned initiatives globally on broadening out sustainable energy for all, but it's often quite difficult to get that international element of providing energy in countries where equality and access are key issues. Do you want to talk a bit about that, Tracy? Where the finance sector can get involved there, and why?
So there's a number of things I think we need the finance sector to do and to be thinking about. But just to put it in perspective, and around just Sustainable Development Goal 7 and the level of investment that we're looking at. So you've got the different targets of SDG 7, and it's estimated that we need about $40 billion annually for electricity access, another $5 billion for clean cooking access. But then if you're looking at the renewable energy target and the energy efficiency target, that's $690 billion, $625 billion respectively. So huge numbers, and that I think other people have said that can't be just public finance. So you need the public finance to really come in and crowd in other sources of capital. And that's particularly true in the hardest to reach markets. So if you're looking at what we call the last mile populations, it's really hard to look at that as a viable market for simply the private sector to come in. But it really goes back to the public finance institutions taking additional risk, putting the first loss capital out there, and then crowding in the private sector. The other thing that I would just highlight is, we really need to look at innovative financial models. And one of the things that we're doing at SE for All and a few other organizations are doing as well is looking at results-based financing. And that's really sort of a way of bringing in the private sector, but doing it with an incentive at the back end when results are shown. So our CEO, Damalola Ogabi, came from Nigeria's Rural Electrification Agency. And while she was there, she was able to implement a World Bank program that used both results-based financing and also traditional tender processes. And the results-based financing has taken off. There's already projects in the pipeline, whereas the traditional approach is still waiting for that pipeline to develop. So that's just one example of what we're looking at is how do we use results-based financing transfer the risk to the private sector, but pull in the donor dollars and others to help support markets that aren't quite there yet, that just need a little bit of a boost. And then over time, we would bring that incentive down. But what we're seeing is that results-based financing, for example, really does deliver connections much quicker. It's much more efficient. And if you are doing it on a results-based approach, you get the connections made, and then you pay the incentive. So you've got some surety there. You're putting the risk on the private sector, but you're also providing some surety to them on the back end. So a couple of things there. Innovative finance approaches being critical, but also looking at the private finance really needing the public finance to come in, create a way to crowd in and reduce risk so that they can really come in and really build those self-sustaining markets.
We often hear that crowding in term, Tracy. How close are we to getting a crowd together here? When I talk to some of the big institutional investors out there globally, I don't see a lot of them as part of this crowd, which concerns me. So I'm wondering where you think the crowding in problem lies here.
Yeah, well, you're right. We're not seeing the crowding in, which is what we hear that message again and again. We've heard that message, I think, for years now. And yeah, I think we need to have an equally important commitment to SDG 7 that we do to other things. And that I think is bringing together all the public finance institutions, getting them to agree on that being a priority. But we are, we're a long way from where we need to be, and it's a different approach. It's putting a priority in a different way. The other thing is really thinking beyond traditional approaches to electricity, for example, and going beyond thinking it just has to be grid-based. If we are looking at the majority of the people who today don't have access to electricity, it is off-grid. It's mini grids and it's solar home systems, and it's a different mindset to think about how do you finance that versus your typical traditional grid extension. But the grid extension really, in many countries, it's just not viable. But it's the other thing that I know we hear a lot about is the difference between financing of coal-fired power plants, for example, and renewable energy. And the traditional approach with coal can happen much quicker than a large renewable energy project that can take years to get financed through. And again, it's a mindset. It's the internal policies of finance institutions, but it's at the top. It is just prioritizing clean energy transition, and energy access, I think.
Great, thanks for that, Tracy. Great answer, really to the point. I'd actually like to put a question to Lawrence that Inge had raised earlier, and she was talking about countries where policy drivers appear to be going backwards in terms of transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And the questioner asked, this is one of the questions from the audience, and we'll take any more of your questions as well for our presenters today. But the question asks, what are the links, if any, between climate action and credit worthiness of sovereign countries? And what are the implications for sovereign borrowing for the recovery? I thought this was a question that might be best suited to you, Lawrence. I'll give you a moment to think about it. Big question, but any kind of sense that some of the plans that we're seeing for both economic recovery and green recovery will start to lead to changes in sovereign creditworthiness? You're on mute at the moment, just to let you know.
Thank you. I thought you would give me some time to. A couple of thoughts come to mind. I'm I mean, it's not impossible that we'll see a day where the rating of a country also depends on its climate policies. After all, I mean, I don't know if you've ever, I guess most of you, and I'm sure you have read sovereign credit analysis from one of the most famous rating agencies. And there's a variety of things, and the medium term is something important for them. So no doubt that we may see that one day. What we observe in the meantime, I think, is a rise among some countries of what we call green budgeting. And as you know, there's quite a few ideas out there which are interesting. One is most countries, when they publish a law or when they publish their budget, they have to have an evaluation or assessment of what that means for example, distributional effect or the efficacy of the policy. And we can perfectly consider, and it's the spirit of green budgeting, that there would be an assessment of how that is contributing to the green footprint of one country. And it's not easy. Just to give you an example, I remember if you take France, for example, when a green bond is issued, then the money is dedicated to some green project, which is very unlike what's in the constitution. Usually you raise the money and the way it is spent is independent on what was raised. It's the fungibility of bonds that you know very well. So we are seeing those changing, and I think they will be important. I'm not aware yet of how rating agencies are including the effort towards climate policy, but I think it's important to keep in mind. You know better than anybody that there's some very large asset managers, and they're increasing their pressure on climate transition. And there again, that's a role for the private sector to actually put pressure, but they also have the money to do it, and that's one of the most efficient way of doing this. At this stage, I think we can say, but feel free to disagree, that we're really in the infancy of sovereign green bonds. The amount of issuance of green bonds on the sovereign side are totally dwarfed by the amount of money that countries are issuing. But it would be, I'm very hopeful when I see the people who are actually looking at and joining the green budgeting issue. And I'm hopeful rating agencies can be positive on this matter. Let's be optimistic.
Just to bring in a slightly pessimistic journalistic note, Lawrence, I wonder if you as an economist were working for an organization with financial imperatives at the heart of what you do, would you be spending your time looking at policy now around the green environment as a driver of economic analysis and potentially financial returns?
Well, I've been an economist in the private sector for an insurer and asset manager, so I can answer honestly. And yes, we did spend some time doing it, especially when looking at investment. It's super important it was, and I'm sure it is increasingly super important to ensure that the money is going to the right place. There was an internal measurement system of how green investment would be. So I think, all asset managers or large institutional investors are completely aware and moving into that direction. They're anticipating what is going to happen looking forward. But there's an area where we can have, I think, more from the private sector, and that's about impact investment. That is still too small, too narrow. I think Tracy was alluding to that earlier on, but it's too focused, too narrow-minded, not large enough. The market is incredibly small. So I think there's a huge opportunity in this recovery to develop it, because this is where there hasn't been enough investment, if I dare to say.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Lawrence. I definitely see more of that interest. Just a bit of a pushback, but actually, I think as a journalist, I'm seeing huge amounts of interest from the finance sector, both in policy and in the money equation. We're seeing huge shifts in technology and pricing across fossil fuels and new tech in the green area as well. Inge, I wanted to bring you in on that point, and I've got another point I'd like to bring in, but just talk about, in a sense, the overlap between what you do as an environmental organisation policy and the finance side of things, because I think one of the questioners asks about how we get so-called non-financial benefits, and we've seen that actually they have financial benefits, and often the terminology is not right here. But how do we get them measured in a format comparable with financial returns? That is often one of the things that's key here.
I'll get to that in 1 second, if I may, but I just want to quickly respond to the earlier point that clearly, I think that more and more of the finance sector is seeing that if we don't take care of these basics that essentially make the world go around, and I'm talking about the Earth systems, then you can forget about the next quarterly profit. Just look at COVID-19. It's a coronavirus. In 2016, UNEP came out with a report, our Frontiers report, that said, watch out, because we are trading illegally, we're pushing wildlife into a corner, we have much more engagement with wildlife, and we are seeing that 75% of new diseases are all zoonoses. So world, watch out. And just 4 years later, we are in a global pandemic of this nature. So understanding that what we are doing to planet Earth is not without consequences and risk is part and parcel of the understanding that if you want to manage those risks, you've got to manage those Earth systems. And we find in UNEP FI, to get towards your the question, that our financial initiative, we got the insurance sector signed in, Principle for Responsible Insurance, because they get it a lot, right? Because they're going to be hit when the hurricane or when the floods or when the fires, etc. So they are obviously understanding. But institutional investors very much so, because that pension needs to pay out 90 years from now or whenever. And that's probably not hydrocarbon investments that have gone into that. And obviously on the banking side as well. So that's quite important. In UNEP, over the decades, we've worked a lot, and you quoted the $100 billion number. That's from TEEB, the UNEP, the economics of biodiversity work that we did. And so we're very proud of that. That takes us 10 years back. But now with the Inclusive Wealth Index that we work on, that sort of says, well, look, hang on a minute. These assets that you have, it's not enough just to measure GDP. That's fine and dandy, but it doesn't give you a full understanding of risk. And so the report that we come out with every 2 years, the next one is about to be finalized, but the one we came out in 2018 showed that more than a third of the countries surveyed, 44 countries out of 140, had declined in their wealth when we take into account the natural wealth that they had. And that means that day when you no longer have insects and pollinators, you already have places where you have to do mechanical pollination. And just think of the cost to your harvest and your food supply. So understanding that interconnectedness, I think there is a beginning of an understanding, and smart investors are getting that, and bigger investors are getting that. But as Laurence has said, the sort of institutional frameworks need to be there. As Tracy have said, the financing on the public side, where these are not yet picked up by the markets, have to be there. And but I think that there is a beginning of our understanding around these. Now, finally, there are companies who, and Unilever is a great example, that stopped issuing quarterly reports, right? Because quarterly reports, that sort of, you fish the oceans empty, the proverbial ocean's empty, and you have a great quarter. But that may not be the smartest way to secure the long-term interest of your investors. And that's the kind of dimension that the finance sector, the forward-leaning, finance sector is beginning to get likewise. A quick profit from a 15-year period it takes to invest to build a power plant till commissioning may not be so quick after all. Whereas little Mkopa in Kenya, you can take a $1,000 loan, put a solar panel on your roof, and you're off, and you pay it off over a period. So I think precisely thinking innovatively and thinking in new ways is a way to go, both for finance as well as for the broader investment space.
Are you optimistic about the accounting side of nature actually being monetized in the right way? I often feel a little bit dirty in sort of describing it this way, but of course it's important in terms of those people in business and finance seeing this as a cost and politicians pricing it accordingly. Are we near that outside of
No, we're not putting dollar signs on trees, and that would be, not what we're doing, although some fear that this is where we land. There is, and that should be said, an intrinsic value in nature. The awe of standing under this moon by the lake at midnight, the beauty of nature is something that we hold in our souls, in our art, and in our religious traditions. And these are not possible to put a value, nor should we. And that is probably what defines nation states and defines the individual. But over and above that, let's understand that if we have no insects, there is a cost because you have to pollinate mechanically. If you have, the services that wetlands provide to be that buffer when it rains, the services that mangroves provide to be that cushion in high storms, the services that coral reefs provide to be the nurseries where fish spawn. I mean, these are real. You can put a value on those. Now, is that, to some, it would be unacceptable because valuing nature is an antithesis to their understanding. But to the economic sector, if you don't have fish spawn, you don't have the next catch. So protecting that coral reef probably matters quite a lot. And it's understanding these connects without monetizing nature per se, but understanding that value is real. And indeed, part of the cost we're seeing of COVID, since it is a zoonosis that did jump from the animal world through a rat, a bat, or a snake, or whatever, to be investigated into the human population, the cost of undermining nature or the cost of driving up climate change is very, very real.
Great, thanks for that, Inga. We sadly we have to say goodbye to Laurence, who has to jump into another meeting. Laurence, it's been great to have you here. We'll let you drop out, and then I'd like to go over to Tracy to answer what I think is a great question, because quite often in these discussions we hear a lot about green investment solutions, impact investment, results-based financing, but we hear a lot less about how to shift this conversation into real transition from dirty fuels, dirty financing. In fact, Laurence made the point earlier, huge, I think maybe Inga or Laurence, I'm not sure, huge discrepancy between what we're seeing in terms of financing still for fossil fuel energy versus the solutions. How do you think we go about having that conversation on a much more purposeful basis? I mean, you're sustainable energy for all. So, in a sense, the transition is there in what you're attempting to do. How do we get that front and center of discussions now that transition finance is serious, it's going to be happening, and it's coming to a portfolio near you?
Well, I think it goes back to a lot of what Inga was saying as well. I mean, we have to get out of this short-termism, is what I would call it, and thinking about it, not exactly monetizing nature, but recognizing the value of it. So, and it's also recognizing the value of people having access to energy, the value of nature, and all that comes with it. And it's creating a sense of urgency as well. We're in this decade of action. We are, less now than 10 years away from when we need to achieve our sustainable development goals. We had momentum, we thought, coming into 2020. It still wasn't where it needed to be. But we've also now, hopefully not completely lost that momentum, but lost some focus. So it's a huge challenge of how do you get that focus back on, addressing the inequality, addressing the issues with nature, addressing the issues with access, while having to deal with an ongoing pandemic. But I think it does, to kind of bring us back to where I think we started in the conversation, if we are thinking about a recover better mindset and approach, I think it's getting beyond that short-termism, thinking about, what are the investments that you can make that jumpstart an economy, address the energy access gaps, can put us on the road to a clean energy transition, all of those things. But it is looking at the benefits that come out of it, and thinking more long term versus what is the 6 months in front of me. But I think even with the Recover Better, though, if we're looking at, for example, the jobs that can come out of some of these investments in clean energy, those can be very quick. So you can also look at making some of these investments with the quick the job benefit, the longer term GDP benefit that can come from it. So I think part of it is really just getting across those messages to the finance community, to countries, the governments that are putting these plans in place, and just getting the right messages out about the benefits, the many co-benefits that can come from the right kind of investment. And if you're thinking about the health impact from electricity, for example, for SE for All, we're looking now across countries, and the electrification of health facilities is a huge issue right now, as countries have to deal with this pandemic. But we're also looking ahead at, okay, when there is a vaccine and it has to be distributed, then what are the cold chains that have to support that, particularly in developing countries, and where are the health facilities that need those cold chains to be able to get it into the more remote communities and populations. So you can think about those. How do you bring those together? And that's addressing a health perspective, but at the same time, it can also be addressing the electrification of a village that can be a co-benefit of electrifying that health facility to address the cold chain and the distribution of a vaccine. But I think it really does come back to the Recover Better mindset and approach, looking at the co-benefits that can come from this, in a lot of cases, the short term, but really over the longer term, and the multiple benefits that can come from the investments.
Great for that. Thanks for that, Tracy. Inga, I'm going to bring you in just to accompany that, some thoughts from you, but also if you could add in a couple of smart disincentives for not putting money behind environmentally polluting solutions or existing brown fuels. What might they be that would enable both the recovery side of things to be given a little bit more piquancy, let's call it that, in the eyes of people in the finance world?
Well, I mentioned a few, but obviously job creation. Renewable, if we stay just with that for a moment, is much more job intensive than is coal or conventional, if I can call it that, hydrocarbon energy, just for starters. And as we have seen the bottom fall out of the job market in many countries, that's an obvious return. I would say, and that's where we need to take this all of society approach, the health costs associated with the cost of environmental degradation, particularly air quality, is very real. In the time of Black Lives Matter, it's probably worthwhile recalling that minorities and people who are discriminated against, and NAACP has actually brought out that 40% of the African American community live in close vicinity to an coal plant, so within 40 kilometers. So there are all kinds of reasons. Health now, that brings a cost to the public purse, as well as a cost to productivity and labor foregone, days of work foregone in terms of cost of environmental degradation. But much more immediate is simply that that the next crisis, and this is sort of the rude awakening, maybe some people are understanding, but COVID-19 is just a small overture compared to what climate change and biodiversity will lose. It's nothing. I'm sorry, it's horrible. But the costs of full-fledged passing the tipping point is something that is unimaginable. And Antarctic, the polar ice sheets and sea level rise, as well as greater intensity of storms, and on and on and on. I don't want to be the doomsday scenario, but the thing is, we can still pull back from this. And we have never before been putting so much money into the economy, ever. And so the fact that we're doing this, and we're even having this discussion, should we not go green? It's just mind-boggling to me, because the clock is ticking, folks. And I am not the doomsday person, but the science is absolutely crystal clear. The UNEP gap report that we issued just before COP25, and we issue a gap report every year, told us that if we were to reach 1.5 degrees, and we really should, if we want to sort of have the Earth as in a reasonably decent state, we would need to reduce year on year on year, the coming 10 years, 7.6% in terms of our CO2 emissions. That was at the maximum of lockdown, pretty much what we were doing. But obviously, the point is not to lock down population and 1.9 billion kids out of school. The point is to make a fundamental shift. And as we're putting 20 trillion into the economy, wouldn't it be smart to do it now? I mean, I'm sometimes lost for words that we have to explain this, but I get that it's getting the alignment. I also get that there's strong interest behind the old, the gray, and the toxic. But what gives me hope, I would say, is that there are these events such as this one where people come to a platform precisely to push forward. What gives me hope is young people who understand this and get this. The media understands this and gets this, and are holding politicians to account. So I think that we are beginning to see something move, but we don't have forever. Believe it or not, we're heading to COP26 in 27 years because we lost a year. That's more than a quarter of a century where we've been discussing whether it would not be a good idea to act on the science, because IPCC has been telling us this for nearly 30 years. So now is really the time, and there will be a time when it will be too late. And so I think that at this point, there are some opportunities that we just have to grab urgently with a sense of urgency, because it won't come back. There will not be another chance where we're putting this much money into the economy. And so now is the time for action.
Thanks, Inga. Just over to Tracy for the last word, I think. Maybe both of you, a couple of things that you'd like to see right now that could underpin the shift that you both have so eloquently put that we need to see. Tracy, a couple of things that might, whether it's youth movements or decisions there, or incentives removed in different places. Give us a sense of a couple of things that might support.
All of what you just mentioned. We certainly need the youth involved, and I think the innovation that's coming from the youth movements around the world, we critically need them to be thinking about these challenges: climate change, energy access, the environment, and use their energy and their innovation to move us forward. The other thing I would just highlight is we need commitments. And the high-level dialogue on energy that takes place next year, that's a big part of what's going to be happening in the lead up to that, and they're at the event. But it's getting commitments on energy. We've got the Paris Agreement, we've got climate commitments, but we need something specific to energy, and it needs to be trackable. So there's all kinds of commitments, and when you say high-level commitments, people's eyes will glaze over. But if it's very specific and it's trackable year over year, and specific to energy as a clean energy transition and/or energy access, I think that's it. That's a big thing, and that's from governments, but it's also from the private sector. It's from finance institutions, all of those. But do it in a way that's transparent and that's trackable.
Great. We are going to have to end there. We're out of time. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to Inge and Tracy, who are both still here, and thanks to Laurence and Angel, and of course the UK Minister Kwasi Kwarteng. Thanks to you for your questions. We will be reconvening in half an hour for the afternoon sessions. Look forward to seeing you then, when we're going to be looking at some challenges and opportunities for green finance post-COVID-19, a sort of extension of this conversation. Some great speakers. Take a break, and we look forward to seeing you back after lunch. Thank you all very much indeed. Goodbye.